pairs, and the vast majority of those pairs are up as in the northern part of the lake, right? Mulver Bay and in those areas, but essentially the northern half, as you can see there, and that's where it's quieter, and B, there's more little coves and islands and things, so that the central and the southern part of the lake are more wide open, and it's just more developed. So there's a couple of pairs in Fox Bay, and and places like that, but as you can see, that whole middle section.
Well, that's the Broads. I mean, they can, that's crazy.
There's not a lot of nesting habitat there. That is where they get stuck in the wintertime, where they're iced in.
I'm surprised
back in January.
we didn't see any over in the, the islands, Mark Island, and Timber and stuff.
I'm sure that
They might be.
Yeah. Those islands, though, they're also, fairly developed.
Yeah.
So it can be hard. Okay. Oh, I'm getting the thumbs up. So are we on air?
We seem to be.
Okay, good. I'm going to go with that. All right. So Pat, if it allow me to say a few words here about LPC by way of introduction to everybody. So welcome everyone. Thank you to our Thursday Night Nature Talk series. My name is Harry Vogel. I'm the senior biologist and the director here at Loon Preservation Committee. A few words about LPC before we get started. So Loon Preservation Committee was created back in 1975 because people were noticing that loons had become less common on our lakes at that point. And the thinking was that if human activities had contributed to those declines, and it seemed likely that they had, then human activities, if they were coordinated and thoughtful, could reverse those declines once again. So that's the hope and the philosophy on which the Loon Preservation Committee was created. Our mission is to restore and maintain a healthy population of loons in the state as part of a viable, larger regional population of loons, to promote or to measure the health of loons and loon populations as indicators of environmental health, the quality of our lakes and ponds, and also to encourage a greater understanding and a wider appreciation of not just loons, but the larger natural world. So we have been working since 1975 to do all of those things through a combination of monitoring and research and management and education. So these Thursday Night Nature Talk programs are an example of that latter piece of those four different kind of areas of operation. And I'm going to say that Patrick Tate knows all of that really well because Pat was actually a field biologist for the Loon Preservation Committee way back in the day. And so we have been following Pat's success and advancement in his career with great interest here at Loon Preservation Committee, because we like to think that those early formative experiences with Loon Preservation Committee contributed to the success that Pat has had. Now, not only is Pat a wildlife biologist for New Hampshire Fish Game, but you are the Furbearer project leader for the organization. And I've heard Pat on NPR and things and giving interviews and things. Always happy to hear your voice and know that maybe we played some small role in that success too. So with that, Pat, I'm going to hand it over to you to take it away.
So Harry introduced me quite well. To add a little bit on my experiences, it was 1998 when I became the Loon Preservation Committee field biologist for Lake Winnipesaukee. And one of the entertaining aspects of it that I find interesting, Tate Taylor was the senior biologist at the time. I phone interviewed with her, and I was supposed to be the Squam Lakes biologist. And so I got here, and they said there was a reassignment, you're going to be out on Lake Winnipesaukee. So a little caveat, if you caught my accent already, I live in southern New Hampshire, very close to the Massachusetts border. So when Kate got comfortable with me, she says, Pat, I have to be honest with you. We put you on Lake Winnipesaukee because you're a large male, you're tough, you have a Massachusetts accent, you wear logging boots, nobody will mess with you. So I was on Winnipesaukee, and earlier Gary talked about Molten Grove Bay and whatnot. I spent all my time there. So an entire summer on Lake Winnipesaukee, I only went to August Bay once, and I never made it to Alton Bay. There wasn't any, at that time, there wasn't any reason for me to go down there. Very fascinating doing the job. By the end of the summer, I disliked boats, and I never wanted to drive a boat on Lake Winnipesaukee again. Lake Winnipesaukee for me was very exciting during the weekdays because it was quiet, and the weekends were just too many people. I wanted to hide, but I couldn't do the job. So it was very eye-opening, a very good first job for me, and the aspect of dealing with people. So you think wildlife biologists always want to be biologists, go in the woods and not deal with people. And the management we do is 90% people management. So with that, I'll lead into what tonight's presentation is about, Bobcats. And so let's see if I get the clicker right. I did it. I am the Furbearer biologist for the department. When I started with New Hampshire Fish Game, so it was the following year, 1999, I moved up through the ranks, became Furbearer biologist in 2007. And I went to a meeting with an interested group about furbearers, and the first question they said to me when I walked into the room was, what's going on with the Bobcats in Hampshire? We're seeing their tracks everywhere. Now, I just got in a position, it was a clean slate. I didn't know a whole lot about Bobcat in terms of what's going on with the population. I said, well, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll find out. It's been a 15-year ride on Bobcats. I still don't know everything. I think I know quite a bit, but with that, I'll present what I do know, and you may have some questions that I don't know. I'm a straight shooter, and I'll tell you if I don't know. So, and that was the end of it. Let's see if I can get the pointer. I wasn't kidding when I said that.
Okay.
So this one doesn't have a pointer, I take it.
Hold on a second. Let's get our technical expert up here.
There's do not touch buttons there, aren't they?
While you're waiting, you want to tell us what the other fur bearing?
So there's 9 fur-bearing species: eastern coyote, red fox, gray fox, fisher, mink, muskrat, beaver, otter. Bobcat are one of them by definition. We have no evidence of mountain lion in the state. Historically, we have the eastern mountain lion, which is an extinct species. There's chances now for western mountain lion to make it to the northeast. That in 2011 that occurred in Connecticut. So for the agency, we don't rely on sighting reports to determine a species presence. We rely on physical evidence because of there's standards to science, and also very controversial. That situation is very controversial. And if we were to say there's something here, we need to prove.
All right, I think we're back.
We're back. Now, does anyone know which one the pointer
The
is?
right, the right and the left arrows.
That
And the pointer is the middle button.
Okay, so in future reference, don't touch the bottom button.
Yeah, okay, good.
Okay, so our Bobcat occupation throughout the United States or North America is all within there. So the dots represent occupied area. You'll see there's a circle. That circle is filling in. So these are rough lines. I'll be upfront about that. So that circle may be smaller than it was. Over here, the shaded area is the historic Bobcat range. So that was pre-European settlization. And since we've changed, so over time we changed habitat, and when we deforested the northeast, it allowed Bobcat to move north. So now their occupation is likely slightly more.
We're working on that.
Yeah, stay with us. I messed it up, so I can't be bothered by this.
Yes,
So we're good? Okay.
we think so.
You should be good. It's in your screen sharing, so here's open. Good.
Harry, you want to get that forward?
Oh, yeah, it's not,
It didn't go. It doesn't mean it's not doing it. It just means
No.
that.
it's not. So that's interesting.
So why is that one area not filled in?
I don't know the answer to that because it's interesting that we're.
Historically, were they there?
Huh.
Historically, were they in that, it looks like Ohio. kind of now.
Yeah, so based on Ohio and Michigan to the left, it is occupied.
Yeah.
I know Ohio has an increasing population now, and they've done a lot of Bobcat work. So based on what we're seeing on the left to what we have on the right, I would say it was historically occupied, but I don't have the answers to what's going on there now. I have my hands full keeping up with New Hampshire. So, all right.
We're on it, Pat. I feel like a technical.
She's getting more exercise.
So it's an interesting thing, right? While we're here, it turns out that, you know, getting an in-person talk is really easy, and giving a Zoom presentation also pretty easy. Combining them, really, really hard, right? That's what we learned. But I think right back in.
We're good.
Okay.
So some interesting thing about bobcats that often people don't think about at all is there's a huge variation in the size of adult bobcats, males being roughly 50% larger than females. The heaviest male I have gotten my hands on was 45 pounds, which an animal that is living under its own power, being a wild animal, that's 45 pounds. They're more slender, so their body weight versus their physical appearance is very different. Their stature is much larger, and a 45-pound bobcat looks very similar to a 60-pound domestic dog as far as height and body length goes. The first time when I saw the cat that large, they gave me more and brought it in, so you got to come look at this cat. I said, I'm busy, I'll look at it. They threw it in the freezer. A marine biologist, a couple days later, goes into the freezer. And so I hear him go in the garage, think nothing of it. He comes back out, he goes, have you seen that bobcat in the freezer? I said, oh, I know there's a couple in there. He goes, no, you got to go in there and look. Its paws were about almost 3 inches wide. It was unbelievable the size of this bobcat. So to date, the largest one I've ever seen, and it came from not too far from here, Tufton Brook, which surprised me. So as you see on the screen, it's sexually mature at 2 years. That's for males. Females become sexually mature at a younger age. At a younger age, they're not usually successful at raising young, but they can breed. So their lifespan, the oldest I have seen from a New Hampshire bobcat is 14 years. That's from aging that we did with their teeth. The average, I would say, is about, now I gotta word this carefully, because younger animals aren't that smart and they don't make the greatest decisions. So when you have if you're using animals that are deceased to get your ages, you're gonna get difference. So I would say if you throw it out there, the surviving wild age is somewhere around 5 or 6. The average age of a bobcat hit on our roadways, though, is between 2 and 3 years of age. So something I point out to think about that perspective when you say, what's the average age? Well, what's your sampling method? Because your sampling method is going to alter that. They're a visual predator. They're very good at sitting, waiting, and then pouncing. They'll stalk short distances. So, you know, if any of you have bird feeders in the winter and you've seen bobcats, you'll see them wait for a very long time, and then they'll run up 5 feet and wait, and then go again. And at the last second, they pounce. And they have this ability to do these amazing acrobatic moves off of any structure needed to catch the prey they're after. And at the end of this, there's a picture that with a little bit of description. I think you'll see. It's strict carnivore. They do scavenge in the sense, more in the winter months. The summer months, because of the decay and how fast the animals start breaking down, they'll scavenge in the summer months at all. But in the winter months, they'll scavenge. Obviously, they prefer to catch their food, eat it, rather than scavenge. But their prey items can be so large, such as a white-tailed deer, they don't have that option to eat everything at once. And during the winter months, that's when they tend to go after white-tailed deer. These dimorphism I mentioned, these pictures are hard to see because there's no scale, but you can tell by looking at it real quick that this cat here was closer to the camera than this other one. These are both New Hampshire bobcats, and if I can point out quickly, winter, and this is summer. This cat went through a rainstorm, so it has a little bit of a different appearance. Notice that both of them don't have a high amount of spotting patterns. Very common for bobcats in the Northeast. So a male, this is a male bobcat, and I'll say that's a very large male bobcat, certainly above 35 pounds. To really quick see what the differences are, use the head as a reference. So the size of that head versus its shoulder or its body. The head looks very tiny versus this one. Female, male. Her stomach is lumpy. She's a breeding female, has young in the area. This is a collared bobcat that we had collared as part of some research that I'll mention later in the Keene area. So Identifying features on a bobcat. If you ever see a cat, wild cat, and your buddies have, and you want to real quick identify it, look at the ears. On bobcats, you have the white splotch with the black perimeter. Then look at the tail. The underside of the tail is white, and you can see it on both those cats. The tail on a bobcat, like this one straight down, that one from my angle appears to be turning up a little bit. You'll see that white wrap around. Only once have I not seen the white completely wrap around. It is because somehow the cat had an injured tail and actually lost a little bit of its tail. So the black was all the way down, the white didn't wrap around. But I've only seen that once. So the other thing is, the question I have to get is it a lynx or is it a bobcat? Look at the feet versus the face. The feet of a bobcat will always be much smaller than the face, whereas a lynx will have these big goofy feet and be almost the size of its face. Brown stockings is common with bobcats, and this, I think the next slide will say it better. We have two color morphs in New Hampshire, a gray color morph and a reddish color morph. The summer months, almost, it's not exclusive, all bobcats are reddish, and they have it to the tone of, I'm sure many in here have seen white-tailed deer in the summer, they're red. The bobcats are very close to that color as far as their red goes. And then in the winter, they become more gray. So shedding occurs in the fall around October. So they'll start going into their winter coat, which is more gray. And then in March, they'll start shedding back into their summer coat. Tracks, I often get asked to identify tracks. So down here, keep nice and easy, claw marks. You can draw an X through the track. Very quick way to identify a canine track versus a cat track. So cat tracks, generally people say more oval towards the, how would I word that, east and west, if you call this north. Whereas dog tracks are longer than they are wide. But I always call cat tracks round. And notice the M-shaped pad, and there's more of a V pad here on the big canine species. So to put it in perspective, bobcat track with the size large men's leather glove. So roughly the length of the thumb there. And then down on the bottom here, what are those? Anyone want to say?
This claw marks, the coyote.
So those are claw marks. That's a domestic dog. Yeah. Coyote tracks tend to be a little more oval. So I said earlier about my logging boots, I still have them. Not the same pair, I still have them. And here you can see this track doesn't quite have that X pattern. And I pointed out because not all tracks have that perfect markings for you to say, oh, that's such and such species. But if you look at this track, same dog, the next track. So depending how that dog is moving across the landscape, whether it's a front foot or a hind foot, the front tend to be slightly larger because of the body weight on them. And it often causes front tracks to look a little different. So a number of factors can change that, but it's good. These pictures are good to show you cat tracks versus dog tracks. And I'll point out later a little bit more. That's if you've flown out of the NHF airport, you didn't fly over you probably didn't fly over this track, but you flew over the marsh that this track was on. Guaranteed you it's right in like that. Bobcat diets change with prey availability. So there was a professor, and the name's blinking out at the moment, but I can say Dr. Levitas kept all the records that the professor kept. So from 1809 to 1973 in the state of New Hampshire, there were Bobcat bounties, varying rates. They weren't paid by New Hampshire Fish Game, and they weren't put in place by Fish Game. It's by the legislature. Wildlife was managed through all those years by the legislature. So there were bounties. And in the 1950s, this professor had a keen interest in bobcats and did all the bounty carcasses and recorded scientific data off that. So what he did is he reported the prey items they were eating. And you can see, so from 51 to 1954, there was a heavy predominance of cottontail rabbits that they took advantage of. But in 61 to 65, cottontails were down, it was snowshoe deer, white-tailed deer. And then 79 to 80, this would have been through legal harvest and hunting and trapping season. Small mammals became a higher dominance. This was through all stomach analysis. And the year, between the years, I'm going to throw out there roughly 2012 through about 14. UNH PhD student did isotope analysis of fur and recreated what bobcats were taking. And small mammals were, again, a large part of their diet. So point being is they're pretty plastic on what they can take advantage of and what's available. With bobcats, I didn't mention anything about reproduction. The top 3 are actually pictures from New Hampshire. These are developing embryos from their roadkill bobcats. So developing embryos, roughly that one was approximately March or April when it was struck on the road. Once they give birth, you don't have the kids to count. How do you tell how many young they gave birth to? And you can't count corpora lutea within their ovaries because they store them non-stop through the years, and you can't differentiate between this year's and last year's. So it could tell you that you have 40 young born. I mean, that's exaggeration right there, let's say 20 young. That doesn't mean they weren't obviously all born last year, but they have what's called placental scarring, and these black marks are left behind from the previous year's births. So this female here gave birth to 3 young the previous spring. Now, when the bobcats are stored in freezers, and some bobcats in general get these solid black marks, and they're very difficult to read. And if you put them on what's called a light table, you can actually see the darker shades of these placental scars at that count. The average reproduction in New Hampshire is roughly 2.2 young per breeding female. The highest number of scars I've seen is 4. I've seen a handful of 3s, many 2s, and many 1s. So this is not a New Hampshire picture. I'm not sure where this picture came from, but I will say the females make very good mothers. Later in the slides, you'll see some data on roadkill animals, and the young of the year are underrepresented in what we find. So we have to backtrack and do some calculations there. And it comes down to females are better suited at stashing their young when they're crossing and moving around the landscape. Their females' home ranges decrease when it's birthing time. And through the work we did with the radio calling effort, we found that they choose higher quality habitat than males. So when they're breeding, they'll shrink their habitat, their home ranges, and they're roughly 11 square miles. And then when you do find them in the thickest type of small mammal dense area you can think of. So we did some work, and so it's up to about 2012, you see there. And I was collecting public sightings. So you're driving down the road, you see a bobcat, you look out the window of your house, you see a bobcat. And we collected those sightings, and it was partially to see what works for monitoring bobcats in New Hampshire. And these, so up until 2012, so 10 to 12 is all the red marks, and that's where you heard it. Yellow is not 1990 through 2004. And see how less there is yellow versus red. So quite a time frame. Obviously, there's something going on, something's changing on the landscape. The other aspect about this that's dangerous to think is this number is increasing. But how many times would someone think to call a Hampshire Fish Game if they saw a white-tailed deer? It's a very common animal, you don't report it. So as bobcats become more common, people report less. So you got to be careful how you use the data, because you can say, well, look, if we took data now from 2012 to 2022, look, it's going down, the species going down, and not the reports. Well, is it an artifact that they're so common that people don't think to report them? That was a concern. Modeling this data, another dangerous thing about it, said that bobcats prefer developed areas, because if you do a GPS point and model it, it was seen in developed areas. So we know that's not true. And what come out of it is the data shows that it's good to show where bobcats are in terms of the state, but not good to use for modeling purposes at the micro scale level.
Like to see huge population of red at the Merrimack Valley. That's where the people are.
That's where the people are, exactly, yeah, so
You don't know
the,
whether the one bobcat that was red there was cited 15 times. Yeah, how many of these
oh,
sightings?
that's
are
another
cited?
thing you don't know, how many times was the same cat recited because of non-markings. So, I didn't mention this, but the chances of that happening are pretty good, and you'd be able to tell based on roads. Females do not share their home range with other females. It's not, it doesn't happen. They will not share their home range with their young. So the female young have to move outside the home range of that female. Males will overlap about 25%, and a female will overlap with multiple male home ranges. The other thing is, I didn't mention, in the reproduction aspect of it, each one of those kittens likely has a different father, and the females raise their father separately. So I point those things out about there's the densities and the spread out of cats. There's a possibility of repeated sightings, but at the level, depending on the time frame you go, pretty small to have a significant factor of resighting at the same animals, but it's certainly an issue. There's no doubt about that. So I mentioned we did, and part of that question that was huge, what's going on with bobcats? What's the population estimate on the animals? In 2008 through 14, we had radio collared bobcats. It ended up roughly 19 bobcats collared down in this management unit, and then by memory, 7 bobcats in here. These sites, I'll say this with science. Sometimes you want to do these great models to pick your areas, and then you find out you don't have any good data to pick your areas. So what do you do? It's just, what do we do? And this area was picked because historically it was thought that the southwest corner of New Hampshire had the greatest bobcat habitat and the greatest bobcat density. So we went down, started capturing bobcats down there. The method of bobcat capture initially wasn't really thought about. Let's go where they're sighted. We'll get a sighting. We'll get permission from the person that sighted it to set a cage trap on their property. We'll catch the bobcat. We'll collar it. The regional biologist down in that neck of the woods had a keen interest on capturing bobcats, helping with the study, and was very good at getting the cooperators who capture bobcats at these locations. Well, we kept catching male bobcats, not the same male bobcats, but at the end of it, we had something like 15, I'm estimating that I have to look at data, but call it 15 males and 4 females. And that just wasn't right because our roadkill data represented more of a 50-50 sex ratio. So something was going on and we weren't quite sure. Well, when it was this area, I'm down on the seacoast. My office is right next to UNH. I took a different approach. I said to our cooperators, here's your permits, go catch us bobcats. I'm not giving you any information. You guys said you can catch us all the bobcats we want, go catch us bobcats. And that was it. They never got a call from me, so-and-so cited one at such and such residence, nothing. So these guys had to fend for themselves and go find their bobcats. And the cooperators were licensed New Hampshire trappers, so they're out in the woods all the time. They went and found bobcat tracks. They went and talked to landowners, found where bobcats were, and set up their cage traps whenever they found sign. One of the trap guys was actually, he'd set the traps and wire the doors open, and then put meat in there and stuff, and then would go check them every 4 days, and it would not set that trap until he saw a bobcat trap. So by doing that, he used his time really good because he was the highest number of cats caught with the least amount of effort put into it. But we were closer to 50-50 here on females versus males, which was fascinating because it was you guys are on your own and they didn't go near the residential areas. Which then got me thinking about sighting reports and looking at pictures that people sent in, and I started noticing that sighting reports in residential areas tended to be more males. So they're higher risk takers. They're the ones more likely to go around the the feeder, so it points to what you're saying, but, so not the same cats, but the same sex. I showed this slide to he earned his PhD with Bobcats in Pennsylvania. We were at a Fur Tech meeting, which is, so there's a group called Northeast Fur Technical Committee. There's a few Canadian provinces and I want to say 17 or so states. Showed this slide and the PhD, earned his PhD with Bobcats, is sitting at the table and just leans forward and goes, "You're stacked with Bobcats in New Hampshire." And I said, "What do you mean by that?" He says, "See all these boundaries? There's no space between." He goes, "You obviously didn't catch all the Bobcats." He said, "But all that space where it's white," he said, "those are filled. Those are home ranges that are filled, and you can tell by the way these are." And it's fascinating to hear him say that, because what will go on in the future with Bobcats? Did we peak? You know, what we saw in the early 2000s, that peak in numbers, what's going to go on in the future? And I still question that. I don't know the answer to that. But so notice this, how they really don't overlap a whole lot. There's a little bit of overlap. I would have to say this one here is likely to be female because of the smallest home range size. I don't memorize, so each color is a different cat. I don't memorize which one is which. So, and this bugger here thought nothing of crossing the Connecticut River. He had a different collar than the others, which was a drop collar. So it was programmed to drop off the animal, and then you have to go find the collar to download the GPS points. So the UNH master's student had to get permission from a Vermont farmer to go on their property to cover that collar. But that cat would cross the Connecticut River, and they did some work, because the question becomes, is it crossing bridges or is it swimming the Connecticut? So they did some, they knew from the GPS points and time how fast that cat would move. And given the points where it was in Vermont versus New Hampshire, timing wise was impossible to go up to a bridge and go down. So it was crossing the river.
Wow.
Wow.
I mean, Connecticut River, sorry. So did some habitat suitability monitoring, and the issue becomes snow depth. So you can recognize right there really quickly White Mountains, and then the tip of New Hampshire, the elevation in the area as obviously the most northern part, the heavy snow depth. So this model is saying that it's not the best bobcat habitat. We do get roadkill bobcats from this area of Pittsburgh, very rarely. I can only recall 1 or 2 per years. And we've had 1 or 2 killed up there for killing chickens. Under state law, people have the authority to protect their livestock. So the rest of it, based on the modeling, New Hampshire is good habitat. One thing to keep in mind, the dense cities, you know, downtown Nashville, Manchester, Portsmouth, there's not great bobcat habitat. The fringes of all those cities do have bobcats visiting them. I have received roadkill bobcats from Manchester, from Nashville, from Portsmouth, and a number of sighting reports. So one thing I've studied through the collar, found that you'll see here. So bobcats like for the forest shrub. They like to use swampy areas in winter. I have a picture of one later on. So shrubs generally associated with wetlands or forested wetlands. Select against developed areas, agriculture areas, and open water. When it comes to agriculture areas, they would skirt the edges or go in the forest. They did not like to go out in the open. Preferred more rugged and steeper slopes with south-facing slopes. So if you're a wildlifer and you hear south-facing slopes, steep, rugged, you're like, oh, winter deer yards. So in the winter, the snow depth is less. So they can take advantage of the lower amount of snow depth and the prey availability there. And then this other one, closer to streams with no significant relation to elevation. It's kind of vague and ambiguous to me. Obviously, what goes against the general sighting report, so this is GPS data. They avoid high road densities and select areas closer to forest edge. One thing I will point out in New Hampshire that we often forget about, we live very close to the forest edge. A lot of our homes are right in the forest, so depending how the data is used and where it's assigned, you gotta keep that in mind, that people see in these developed areas because we do live close to the forest edge. What part of the state would you call this? Based on the picture, like if you were to say, would you say, I'm in southwestern New Hampshire, White Mountains, Great North Woods, or southeastern New Hampshire? So it's close. Different, you think different? It's southeastern New Hampshire looking towards southwestern.
Oh.
And this area now, unfortunately, the logging occurred because they put the development in that, and they logged to show the Conservation Commission where the roads were going to be. But I took the picture because it's a perfect visual of when you get in some elevation and you look out over what southeast New Hampshire is. This is in the town of Hudson, New Hampshire, which is borders Massachusetts, Tingsboro, Massachusetts, probably 4 miles away from that vicinity. And we have bobcats living down there amongst all that forest. Part of what makes this deceiving is you can't see down these valleys. There are roads in all those valleys. There are homes in the valleys. You're just seeing the hilltops in the forest, so it gets really deceiving. This here picture is called Cohos Marsh. That marsh, we all fly over when we land at Manchester Airport. The property is owned by New Hampshire DOT, and New Hampshire Fish Game owns some property on the other end. The picture I showed you earlier with the track and the glove next to it was taken the same day this picture was here. So there was a bobcat that walked this main channel. If you look at the background, what I said they slept for earlier, wetlands and shrub, right outside Manchester, New Hampshire, Cohos Marsh, there are bobcats using that property, which is fascinating because when you're out there, you can look up and see planes a few hundred feet above you with their landing gear down, going to the airport. So, my point being is those areas aren't the greatest bobcat habitat because of the road densities and the size of their home ranges. They are able to live down there and they're able to make use of those conserved areas. So one thing you hear a lot about is camera traps, and we're doing some current camera trap work with UNH. A little bit different than what I'm going to talk about at this point. But the question is what's a way to monitor bobcats, determine where they are on the state, get some type of index or monitoring, and in the 2005 to 2010, camera traps, game cameras were becoming very popular. So one of the master's students did a study and was able to get approximately 100 volunteers, did 167 surveys, and the units were here you see labeled A, B, and C. So they had quadrants they had to go put cameras in. And then those tracked how many camera nights they did, how many detections, and how many towns were detected bobcats. There's a protocol they had to follow. And then that data was compared to what hunter observations state. And it was to compare what model may work best. And with hunter observations, it's hard to read, but from 2009 to 2014, there was 92,141 hunter outings assigned to 248 towns, right? They call it townships. And then 89,748 outings assigned to 24 WMUs. So for wildlife management, we have what's called wildlife management units, and the sections of the state broken up by roads. It's done so that people who hunt can, when they report their sightings, can look at the map and say, okay, it's between these two roads. Using town lines is difficult when you're in the woods. What, you know, was I in Moultonborough or was I in Meredith? Where exactly was that? So by roads, though, you know exactly what side of the road you're on in this little town. So it was found that with hunters, that they go out into the habitat where bobcats are, and the information that they were getting back was really good regarding with Bobcat distribution. So it's a good index. There's obviously issues with that because if you're a noisy hunter, Bobcats hide from you. If you're a silent hunter, Bobcats don't know who you are. So the interesting thing was, so right here was the hunter sightings detected Bobcat in 13 northern towns and 13 southern towns that public sightings failed to detect. So public sightings was the one that I showed you earlier. That was just the general public seeing them from outside the house. Let's see. So 938 public sightings from April 2009 to March 2014. 886 assigned to 187 townships, 819 assigned to 23 WMUs. So hunter observations slightly outdid that. There was a trade-off between the two. We have 180 townships and 212 of 259 towns surveyed. So again, neither one's perfect, but if you get all this information put together, you can start painting the picture. I mentioned we're doing a camera study now with UNH, and we started, I don't have a picture of what we're doing, but I'll describe it using this map. We started off down in the southeast with 75 game cameras to monitor furbearers, and they're using statistical models to get a relative abundance and distribution of species. This coming year, that work is being spread statewide for furbearers, and then the north for moose. So the furbearer cameras will record moose data, and the moose cameras will record furbearer data too, so they can be melded together and use of each group of wildlife. Moose obviously belong to the furbearers, multiple species. And when that's done, there's going to be roughly 275 game cameras spread out through the state of New Hampshire, recording images of wildlife. And it'll give us a statistical model to attempt to determine relative abundance and the spread of species across the state. That's another index. It takes out that takes the human disturbance factor out more, not entirely, because when you go in and check a camera, there's a slight human disturbance. Cameras check approximately twice per year to limit that. So that's coming work. I have no results to share with you guys because it's ongoing, but it's future work that we're going to do. So we have some information based on Bobcat deaths in the state, and I'll show you that information. I mentioned earlier, females make really good parents, and they keep their young stashed. The number here for males tend to be more risk takers, and the number down here is underrepresented. That 47. How do we have 47 half-year-olds and then 44 1.5-year-olds? Why is that such a disparity? Because of survival rates, that number should be greater or different. It shouldn't be that close. So when work is done, have to backtrack and calculate a number for that half-year-old. This is the age of animals. This is the number of females, number of males. So the total by age. These are all New Hampshire Bobcats. These numbers here are all about New Hampshire Bobcats. The large proportion of those are roadkill animals. I suspect the next slide I'll go back. I'll back up in a minute. So like you see here, the red bars, those are the animals collected that are vehicle kills. Blue, we have animals that continue to be shot in New Hampshire, and oftentimes people think that's illegal hunting. It's not illegal hunting. It's predominantly people raising chickens. They get frustrated with bobcats and continue to come in and take their chickens. They're usually free-ranging chickens. Bobcats are smart. They don't come in and kill the whole flock. They'll take one on average per day. So if you have a flock of 60, it usually takes a week or two before you realize your flock's shrinking. And by that time, that bobcat is cemented, knowing that the refrigerator resides on that property. And getting them to leave the area is very difficult. Their home range will decrease because they got that easy food source. So if it's caught quickly and the chickens are cooped, bobcat will move on. If it's not caught quickly, the bobcat lingers a little longer. So along that front, there's a word nuisance trapped here. And I want to point that out, in the state of New Hampshire, if you have a nuisance bobcat, it has to be trapped and relocated by the rule. But what can happen is a landowner doesn't know it's a bobcat, sets a lethal trap for a raccoon, and then bobcat comes in and gets it because it's a lethal trap. We are conservation officers, we have certified law enforcement officers, they investigate all situations and apply the laws as necessary in those situations. So they are investigated. There's a dark blue, says euthanized. Sometimes cats are found in very emaciated condition in agricultural settings and they're reported to the department. Our officers will shoot them. Sometimes they're hit by motor vehicles, they're on the side of the road still alive. Our officers have to shoot them because they're non-rehabable. If a cat appears to be rehabable, it will be brought to a wildlife rehabilitator and rehab. There have been some rehab in the state, they don't show up in the state. If you read the bottom, I will say, and I only know of one animal where it's a licensed trapper caught a bobcat in a football, and a predator came in and killed the bobcat. It's unknown what species it was, but based on experience and what I've seen over time, it may have been another bobcat that had done it. I've had situations where conservation officers have turned in severely injured cats to me, that ones that they had to euthanize, and there's been evidence of fights with other bobcats. The most severe was a 30+ pound male bobcat. He was blind in both eyes. One eye had a puncture wound from a claw, and the other eye had a laceration right across it, and it was from the claw. So,
If you interpret the vehicle data there, if you can ignore 2020 because
yeah.
there was a lot less vehicles on the road because of the pandemic.
So
You ignore that data point and just eyeball the rest of the red lines, it shows a definitely increasing trend.
yeah, you're gonna see a lot of increasing trends as we go on.
Yeah.
I'll point out right up here, 220 is incomplete. So this graph was created in 2020.
Oh, it's just
As we were
yeah.
collecting, so this is, so if I recreated this now, I have a higher data point there. I don't recall exactly where it falls. But what you're pointing out is that trend, you get a linear type line with an increasing trend.
I mean, perhaps there's more traffic on the road, but not at that rate.
Yeah.
And not going from 10 to 50. That's
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
dramatic increase.
You're gonna see some other slides along that line. Black bars down here, because this is tracked, and I want to make, we have a Fisher harvest season, and which Fisher harvest use their lethal traps. Bobcats will get into those on occasion, so we collect that mortality and I report that mortality. So you'll see that went up and then it went down, and the people, the licensed trappers now, they're very frustrated because if they see bobcat tracks, they're pulling their traps, they're leaving the area because they don't want it. Nothing bothers a person, and it's probably weird if you're not a trapper to understand this, but it frustrates trappers and bothers them if they catch a species that they can't utilize and they have to turn it in. It's very frustrating for them, and in their eyes, a waste. I'm going to call it resource or waste of the animal. So they'll pull their traps and leave the area, and it's a complaint we're getting a lot from people who trap in the state. So I'll go back to these other slides now. When this slide was created in 2019, I had recorded data of 500 free bobcats. That's somewhere up close now. I can't tell you the exact number, but 600. And predominantly, as you saw that previous slide with the red roadkill. So with the data, we can then put it through statistical modeling. And with our age class, so there was, and I bring this up because there was in the UNH work that was done in the around 2012, they developed a population estimate for the state that was extremely conservative because they didn't have this data. In 2012, we didn't have all these roadkill collections. We were collecting them, but we didn't have enough to do any modeling. So through the work we've done with the placental scars and that chart I showed you previously, we have a 54% survival rate of our kittens and a 72% survival rate for animals 1.5 and 72% survival rate for 2.5 plus. So they're good survival rates for our cats, which leads us to, this is another aspect of what's the growth rate of the population. And because there's an interest within the state about what's your harvestable portion. all these subject matter has to be talked about in terms of wildlife management. So in the work with the conservative estimate, they used a survival rate of 36% from Oklahoma, which that was a declining population. If we had a survival rate of kittens of 36%, the estimated growth of the population, also known as the harvested surplus, would be 32 animals. If it was 45%, 126. But we know that our kitten survival rate is 54%. And so we're growing at a rate of 15% a year on average. And that means the population is increasing per year at the current rate of about 215 animals. Went through that. Our age distribution. So bobcats start out roughly 50-50 when they're born half born male, half born female. But males are higher risk takers, so they drop out a little bit, and then over time, after two, they eventually catch on to be a little bit smarter about their decisions. So you see that curve kind of mellow out. But that's the distribution of our bobcat survivorship, which is quite interesting. And that's based on that data that was collected through these reports and other mortality factors. So mean survival rate for a male, 72%, and mean for a female is 74%. You mentioned about the curve, and it shows increasing. So this is the statewide average bobcat observation rates by deer hunter male survey. And this shows roughly a 90% growth in the sightings through this time frame to 2017. I use this graph because that's what I had available quickly. And when we continue to show an increasing in sightings by deer hunters. And that was based on 17,800 hunter days and 92,700 hours of hunters during those time frames. So, and that's annual. So quite a data set when we look at those numbers. USDA Wildlife Services, a person calls in and has an issue with an animal. Sometimes they'll be directed to a conservation officer or a wildlife biologist. For the most part, we try to direct them to USDA Wildlife Services because it tends to be agricultural related. And this is the trend of calls. So you see here at the bottom, number of calls received. Each one is the number of calls. And then that's an exponential fitted line to that. So you see that curve again. So something flipped it around. At the office, I have that rate of change. And by memory, it's slightly above the previous one I showed you, but it shows that, again, growing trend. The difficult aspect of that is, as the animals become more abundant, is it lower tolerance of the animal, or is it a growing number? So again, can't go by this graph just alone. Free-range fowl, I mentioned, is the #1 complaint by the public, which why they go to USDA. Did anyone ever have a Muscovy duck or grow up with a relative that had a Muscovy duck? No. I have a Muscovy duck experience from when I was a child. My grandfather had a Muscovy duck, and whenever we went over there, it was protective of the house like a guard dog. And it would fly through the air and dive bombs, and it would fight and chase us all around as little kids. For a little kid, it toughened you. At first, it was traumatizing, and it really toughened you up. So this here is a Muscovy duck, and I don't have this. I didn't put the series of pictures in. That is a abandoned beaver pond. We beavers occupied it at one time. We abandoned the water receded, and there's pictures of this bobcat swimming after the Muscovy duck, going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. And the people saw it, they're like, I'll never get the Muscovy duck. The bobcat was able to swim down and get the Muscovy duck, which was very surprising to me that bobcat pulled that. And the other sighting report, I mentioned use of bird feeders. These are pictures taken from observation points where bobcats took advantage of bird feeders. During the winter months, turkeys will often use bird feeders. People have witnessed bobcats sit and wait until the turkeys come in and then just full bore out there. And I've received 2 reports where bobcats have leaped into the air and caught turkeys midair, pulled them down. There was speculation that the rebound of turkeys throughout New Hampshire led to the rebound of bobcats. But I mentioned earlier about the isotope analysis that was done. And in the isotope analysis, through all the collections, there was no indication that turkeys are associated with the rebound of bobcats. They do take them, but bobcats do take turkeys, but it did not appear to be a huge food resource that was helping to the rebound. Certainly participating, but it wasn't that point where you have a massive amount. Small mammals, on the other hand, like squirrels, at least up until 2018, because that's when we had the squirrel crash. We're rebounding now. Squirrels were a large take. And again, they will wait they'll wait in the forest to do it too, but the winter months, if there's a bird feeder, they will sit for hours, like 5-6 hours as a statue, just waiting and go for it. So with that, I think I covered most. I hope some of you have questions. That's my last slide. So yeah.
You said they take down deer?
Yes.
How big?
Yes. On to adult size.
You're kidding.
And I mentioned that bobcats were sexually dimorphic. The behavior is more common in male bobcats than females with the adult deer. And the adult deer, it happens during the winter months when there's snow on the ground. And it's a factor of two things. Food's more limited in the winter for bobcats. Deer have less mobility than the snow. Deer home range shrink down into winter areas. And that's when you'll start to see more bobcat mortality in the deer. Also, it's a dangerous aspect to do, and they can injure their bodies or break fangs taking down what's there. The emaciated column we had in there predominantly is males that are over 6 years of age and have lost more than 3 of their canines. And when they lose their number of canines like that, they can tend to become issues in domestic settings or developed areas, preying predominantly on house pets. So yeah, it's bizarre how these you can, being in my position so long, I actually people call up and I can be like, this is my prediction. And then when the conservation officers get the cat, it's oh yeah, you're about 80% right with that. So it's surprising. Yes.
So these bobcats hunt one-on-one, they don't hunt in packs?
They do not hunt. So as adults, they're one-on-one, they're solitary animals. During the time of breeding, females and males will come together. So breeding occurs in the winter months. In our collaring project, this was fascinating. We had a female, we collared her, and then we picked her up on game cam, walking through a deer yard with a male. And there was evidence that she was taking advantage of being with a male because he would take down white-tailed deer and she could feed on that. But it's during the breeding period too. As soon as they mate, and it's the summer months, she does not tolerate having other cats around her kittens, and she stashes them and she stays solitary. The males stay solitary. They'll tolerate interactions with other males sometimes, but when they're hunting solitary.
What predates a bobcat? What are the predators?
Yeah, so their predators tend to be at the young age, and where that could be an issue is with barn owl, owls, great-horned owls. Coyotes can be an issue, and that's generally it. Maybe I suspect it'd be probably a little more difficult for an eagle to be an issue because they take advantage of the forested settings and they don't fit well in big open areas. So that changes. Oh, Fisher, I didn't mention Fisher. Fisher are pesky little buggers, but bobcats are pesky on Fisher. So they mentioned this in their food diet. They found this in Minnesota, and they also found some issues in California. California was a Fisher reintroduction effort, and their female Fisher kept getting killed. So then they were recovering carcasses, and when they could, amplifying the DNA on the killing wound, and it was coming back predominantly bobcat. In Minnesota, they had issues where they noticed that when bobcat populations were high, Fisher numbers were low, and they were trying to get more robust Fisher numbers. And they did some work out there, what was killing Fisher, and it was bobcat and predominantly females. So the bobcat will prey on Fisher, and Fisher are sexually dimorphic as well. Females are about half the size of males. which the females are more likely to get targeted. So that's an issue there. The reverse to that is there's arguments that Fisher can take young bobcat. But I'll point out, it's how well it's known, it's hard to say, because some of that work is based on what they've observed, and or some of that thought is what they observed in Maine. With lynx, the top predator at the end of the year, lynx is fishing. So it's a very complex world.
Can you explain what is a fisher?
So if you, normally in New Hampshire, you'll hear fisher cat. That fisher, but the correct term is fisher, it's a weasel animal. The females are about 4 to 6 pounds, and the males are upwards of 9 to 12 pounds. They are a forested species, they climb trees, they hunt squirrels, small mammals, and they have, I'll say, their reputation is far worse than what they actually are. Fisher get blamed for a lot of Tate that they necessarily do not do, especially with domestic house pets. So they're a very interesting creature and hated by others. But. Any other questions?
So what is your reason, what is your hypothesis for this exponential rise in the population?
So why is it occurring? Yeah. I didn't mention Canada. So the history of Bobcat, 1809 to 1973, Bobcat 73 to about 75, no close season. You go do whatever you want as people in the state. 75 to 89. So in the late 70s, off and on harvest seasons, through the 80s to 89 harvest seasons, regulated time frames you could do it. And then from 89 to 2007, very little data on bobcats in Hampshire. Quebec had the same issue, and Quebec was, and then other states had all saw the decline in bobcat numbers. So this is a long answer to it of why. New Hampshire started doing the study I brought forward here. Quebec had questions what was going on there. They went through the historic data, and their historic data most aligned with data in Maine. So then they took all the weather data and the snow depth data and put it together to their bobcat harvest data and laid it all out. And what they reported, the decline of bobcats was very well correlated with the 1970s, the snowiest decade on recorded history in the Northeast. So there's a suspicion that that decline was actually caused by snow depth issues. And then those snow depth issues, we had a huge crash in white-tailed deer in the 80s. So with their winter use of white-tailed deer, that could have further impact. So in the 90s, we had a very large population of fisher, and the bobcat numbers were very slow. And then around the year 2000, our fisher numbers started going this way, and our bobcat numbers started going the other way. So there's a lot of noise in the data, but if you lay it out and start looking at that data, there's some really interesting trends. Our winters have been more mild, which allows bobcats to do better. Our fisher numbers have decreased, which allows bobcats to do better. And our deer numbers have decreased with the mild winters. So there's multiple factors. And the states around us are reporting increased bobcat as well. Massachusetts, like New Hampshire, right to the eastern border, have bobcat. So I failed to show you guys these. You saw me walk in with them. So it's just over kitten. I'm glad you said that, because I was going to ask, what would you just discuss? This cat is just over a year old. I can't tell you if it's male or female because at that age they overlap. It's their winter pelts.
It's a winter.
Yep, they're winter pelts, but you can tell by the coloring and how their fur is. So I'll pass this one around if you want to touch it. They're tanned, and it's called, the type of tanning is garment quality, which means that you can handle it real fast. Now, so that one's in between 1 and 2 years of age, and I can categorize them based on size in general. Bobcats this size generally average between 2 and 3 years of age. So the bobcat right there is no more than 10 pounds. And this one I'm holding would be between 15 and 20 pounds. And I can't tell you the sex on that one because they overlap on their body size when they're in that range of 15 to 20.
That's a male.
That's a male. So this cat is over 30 pounds. I've handled so many, I can't tell you the exact weight. The one I mentioned that was 45, when I held it up like this, its feet touched the ground. So it was as long as I was, yeah. And I'll probably, and I likely won't see one that long again based on numbers. Out of the 600 Bobcats I mentioned, I've seen 3 over 40 pounds.
Okay.
And if you noticed, as I've shown them, the spotting patterns, they vary a little bit. Some have more spotting on the sides than others. The spotting is generally mostly on the stomach. If you look at the ears, you'll see the not very well on this one. But you can see that white splotch. The tail's a little more difficult because of the way the tails are split. But you can see that this would normally be turned together. You can see the white on the side and the white over the top. And the fur is just unbelievable.
Oh, it's so
soft.
Did you want?
Yeah, they just change in size. The fur density is all the same.
Size of the dogs.
So it's not all the cats get
I'll go back.
health and used for educational items just because there's so many. So these are select ones that we pulled out.
You said they mate,
Thanks.
when do they primarily mate?
Their mating primarily occurs in February towards March.
What's the gestation period?
Yeah, I don't remember this exact number of days. Their young are born and in about the month of May. But that's in general. So one thing fascinating about Bobcats is they can go into heat any time of year and reproduce any time of year.
Really?
Yes, and I had 2-pound kitten Bobcats turned into 1 year in January.
Oh my God.
And I was very confused by it because how did these cats die last June and stay in this quality? And I'm sitting there, this doesn't make sense. So I kept researching about it, and that's when I dug up the research that it's rare, but they can breed any time of year for each young. So those kittens were born in January and they froze to death. And that was up in Whitefield, New Hampshire, where that occurred.
So you mentioned that Fisher, there's a season for Fisher?
Yeah.
Why?
So that's a great question. They are wildlife is a public resource.
Yeah.
People have different opinions on how to use wildlife and the value of wildlife. As a state agency, we support all user groups. So if there's ability to have harvest season, we regulate it in a fashion so that there isn't detrimental to the population. We will allow that. So obviously that takes public support. And with Fisher, we have that public support. Another factor is we can attempt to use it to manage wildlife populations in some manner. I mentioned nuisance wildlife. We continue to have Fisher that get killed every year as nuisance wildlife by people. So there's a level of, if you have too many, you have more people dislike that species. If you have too few, more people love that species.
Well, they're
So-
also very loud and very scary.
So I've never heard, that's a common thing I should
haven't?
mention. I've never heard a Fisher scream.
You're kidding. Oh, you know it when you.
I have had many videos turned in of a Fisher scream.
Yeah.
And then I found on YouTube and I said, did it sound like this? And they're like, yeah, it sounds exactly that. That's a fox barking. And you can see the fox barking. So that's been my experience. I've talked with wildlife rehabilitators saying, have you ever heard a scream? They said, no, they don't scream, but they chirp. And a churtle is like it's a little, yeah. And a biologist who worked with Fisher it was either late 70s or early 80s. We asked him, have you ever heard? He goes, no, I've never heard a scream. I've heard a chirp. And he described the same thing that the rehabbers. So my experience has been fox misidentified.
Because we had a Fisher, we lived in Hudson, way back, and it lived
Fish across the street.
right across the street. He was big.
Yeah.
And I could have sworn it was him because we never saw a fox, but that would mean anything.
Yeah, I can only go by my experiences. So I'm not saying you didn't hear.
And we have feral cats and they're gone.
Fox and coyote will do that too. And that
Oh,
goes,
yeah.
Fisher often get blamed
Right.
in most instances. They sort of, so
Yeah.
We didn't care if we took them.
Patrick, I have a picture of what I think is a rebound that was living under my porch for a little bit of time. In our neighborhood, it's like seasonal.
Yeah.
So it's pretty quiet.
Yeah.
And
April.
it just like was on my, I went to
Just
go out
showed
the
up.
door, and it was like,
Yeah.
baby bobcat, I'm not going out the front.
April's a tough time of year for them, and that's characteristic.
And he stayed there too.
And like you said, on the bird feeder.
Yeah.
I think it's a girl, because it's little, it must be a female.
Did you turn that picture into the department?
No, but
Can I
I
see
sent it to Joe Canfield, so he had it.
I've seen that.
Did Joe show you? Was that the?
I don't, wait, no, that's what, I think I've seen that picture. Someone has shown me that picture.
Okay, because I
So-
sent it to him and he said, I said, what do I do? It's under my porch. I
Yeah.
don't, you know, so
On
he
the front
goes,
steps.
he said, it was on the front steps. He said, don't worry about it
Yeah.
because if you make a lot of noise, it'll go away. And eventually it did because people were starting to come up on the weekends and so, but it was
So-
beautiful. It was just a beautiful.
Oblivious to everything around it too.
Well, you guys can see it. It's definitely a young bobcat, roughly
I think
just,
that's-
probably just under a year of age. And it's on her deck, like she said, it's underweight, so it's, you know, its clothes look a little too big for its body. When they get that way, they get very tolerant of human presence, and they start to use plowed and shoveled areas because of easy movement. And if they find a bird feeder, they'll do just what she said, they'll stay there, so they can have bird feeders. A dangerous thing about that is they bring themselves in close proximity to residents that may be poisoning mice. And mice kind of go out in the environment, so they can put themselves in a bad situation of potentially getting those antiseptic residents. But it's common.
How old are they when the mother says
Yeah,
bye?
so the mother tolerates her young for roughly a year, because when she's going to give birth to her next young, you gotta go. And she won't tolerate overlap with her female. She won't overlap with her male. The female will, just based on their own decisions, go just far enough to find a vacant home range outside her parents' home range. The males will just go, and they'll keep going until they find something vacant. And with other bobcats in the area that tolerate them. So a male bobcat is more likely to go 50, 60 miles versus 5 miles. I keep thinking of all these great little tidbits. We had about dispersals, there was a Lakes Region bobcat that was collared over in Guilford. We collared him, he was perfect health. About 2 months later, he was released, perfect health, no injuries, because we hold them in a crate, we watch them, released down, the way they leave, we get to watch them, perfect health. It was 2 or more months, it was more than 2 months, probably 3 or 4. We get a report, this bobcat's injured, you guys need to remove the collar right away. Public site, and they showed us the video, showing enough he's limping. So the cooperator who trapped him, we told, you know, we knew his home range, and he was staying, he really used this one area a lot. And we had trail camera after trail camera picture of him looking at the K-trap, he wouldn't go back in, he would not go back in, we spent a year trying to catch him. So he disappeared, so like, well, that's it, he disappeared. We had all this data because of the way the collar was, we were like, well, we lost the collar, it is what it is. So about a year and a half, maybe it was almost 2 years later, Quebec government emails me saying, hey, what's the possibility one of your bobcats is up here in Quebec? Slumped to none. The closest we had a few collared was up in the Guilford area, Lakes Region, and that's X amount of miles from the Quebec border. And there's only one left with the collar. He had a bum leg. We doubt he went up there. A few weeks later, Maine has a regulated harvest season. A person captures person who traps, captures that bobcat. It's legal to take it, takes the bobcat and mails to Maine the collar and the ear tag. And it was indeed New Hampshire's bobcat that was radio collared in Guilford. And it went, we don't know its route because the radio collar was now, it didn't work anymore. But we know it went up into Canada in the proximity of where the Maine New Hampshire border is.
He was on the way.
And he just went over the border. He did that with a bum leg, like he had a good one.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, they're amazing animals. So. If that, I think I'm done. If there's no other questions.
Comes under the cool job description.
Very good.
Cool
I'm
job.
not quite done. I do have one question for you two.
Okay.
We got a question off the chat, and I'm not sure how to pronounce part of this, so you're gonna have, bear with me on this one, but someone wanted to know if male bobcats get larger masseter muscles?
Oh,
Jaw
No,
muscles.
like tomcats.
Yes.
Okay,
Yep, they're, so when you compare a adult male bobcat versus adult female bobcat, you can see the robustness in their muscles, and their fur features are a little bit different because they have that rough. They appear a little bit more masculine. And their skulls, their bones are slightly thicker.
Very good.
thank you.
Thank you very
You
much.
get a cool job too.
We are lucky.
Well, you need to tell people, to go be a biologist, you can do this.
You know,
Oh, that's not bad. Yeah.
Now you can say smaller.
and then I can run right in there.
Yeah, so
Not the bears.
I don't do, I don't, we haven't
Not
been a
autism,
project
maybe.
either.
No.
Yeah, I'll get called out on